Welcome back to the History Hour with Mr. Kent
and Professor White.
We return once more to our Mesopotamian history series. Formerly, we have covered the period spanning the Late Stone Age to near the end of the Bronze Age, when the river valleys were divided between Kassite Babylon and the Middle Assyrian Empire. The events which more or less divide the Bronze Age and the later Iron Age is the Bronze Age collapse, an event of some mystery which rocked the ancient Near East and forever changed the course of human history. But what did happen? We have scant evidence. In fact, most of what we know comes from Egypt's accounts and letters sent between cities in the days and years leading up to the destruction. Other than that, researchers have sifted through the ruins and the evidence, and the end result is complicated, as most everything in history turns out to be. So I think the only major change of note I would like to bring up is the fact that we have begun experimenting with background musics. If you like them, great. Leave a comment, like the video, etc., and you know what to do. If you hate them, I guess yell at us all stupid, maybe throw a few suggestions. We'll look around. I don't know, we're just experimenting. I've said before, the only point I think I'd like to elaborate on from the last episode is we talked a little bit about how tricky it is figuring out what's going on in some periods. There's so many names and dates and events flying around, and there's also these records that come from different people who have different, one, perspectives and two, motivations. When the Assyrians got involved in the Kassite sort of dynastic army rebellion, there's a couple names that come up after the overthrow of the Kassite king Har-Hardash. The names Nasi-Bugas and Suzigas, I mentioned that possibly being the same person, but different names and different records. It's entirely possible those were actually two separate pretender rulers who had different factions of the army, maybe different clans, different nobles fighting for them. It's that thing. It's very complicated. There's a lot of stories that play out that this sort of thing likely played out all throughout history. The various wars of the early dynastic period, probably all kinds of little twists and turns and personal struggles and court intrigues and the like. Often, too, these events are simplified by the fact that at the time, the literate classes are relatively limited. The scribes are a professional class. The nobles and people like merchants might well have had access to literacy. But the amount of people who would be writing about this is also severely limited by the amount of people who would be interested in writing down the exact events, perhaps in the period in which the guy who took over from them is now in charge. Like, are you going to want to chronicle the rise of the pretender king who reigned during the era between you and your father's reign, who was probably responsible for your father's death? Once you get into the whole, these people are often supported via the money and the power of the state. They write down what the state wants them to write down. So that's the reason why you get a lot of this whole son of nobody, and we don't really know about the pretender crises and the interim periods, because the interim periods are considered eras in which illegitimate people are in charge. Speaking of dating being a slightly complicated thing, mixed by the fact that all these people had different calendars, often dated from the length of a reign, the dates for events like these often change from time to time as people unearth new things, events are corroborated. The dates we've used in the past might be accurate, might not 100% be accurate. Even if they're accurate now, a year from now they might not be 100% accurate. For example, the Bronze Age collapse, which we'll be talking about today, a fairly recent author, Eric Klein, wrote a pretty solid book on this, and you can find some lectures of his on YouTube if you're interested. His book, when he originally had the contract to write, was entitled 1186, because that was supposedly the major date. During the course of writing it, the date was changed, and he changed now the book to 1177. Then, sometime in between the finishing, the publication, and the shelves, the date was once again pulled back to 1186.
For all these reasons, that means, for the most part, at least when I teach classes or write papers, I try to use approximate dates, ranges that kind of explain this is when events were happening, even if we don't know the exact year it was happening in. And unfortunately, the further back you go, oftentimes it's the best you've got to work with.
The obvious question that comes to mind in a series about Mesopotamia, which strictly is about the Fertile Crescent, is about the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, why are we doing an entire episode on the Bronze Age collapse? And the Bronze Age collapse is more of a Aegean, Mediterranean, Anatolian, Egyptian sort of phenomenon. The simple answer is, by this point, Mesopotamia, even if it strictly falls within those geographic limits, and the Fertile Crescent does kind of touch those areas of Canaan and the Levant and Syria and whatnot, but even falling among the strictest definitions of falling between the two rivers, the worldview of Mesopotamia is expanded greatly. In this time, they conduct diplomacy, they conduct trade, they have a good idea of who is in Egypt, what's going on in Hittite lands, all these sorts of things. The Mesopotamian world is not only aware of, not only connected to these places, but they're integrally linked. And when these places suffer such a dramatic collapse, such a dramatic, violent event that shakes everything up and causes the system to collapse, the Mesopotamians are heavily affected by it. The sea people we talk about might not have had any coastlines to raid in the Kassite lands, but the things they did and the sort of migration waves that they were only one piece of heavily affect the region. And it is a change that has a rippling effect. Without understanding the collapse, you won't be able to truly understand why the Neo-Assyrians become what they do, why the future Mesopotamia shapes up in the way that it does. And also to demonstrate this, think about some of the events we've talked about in the past. When we've talked about the end of the Sargonic Empire with the various invasions by different peoples, the rebellions internally, the vassal kings fighting one another, the droughts and the famines that likely precipitated, in a large way, that is a sort of small run of this. And there have been many smaller events scattered throughout the age that were like this, but on a small scale. Every time once you had a major war that ended decisively, when a city was sacked, when they broke the walls and they killed the soldiers and they killed the king and they put people in chains, they carted them off, they put them in servitude, slavery, it's like a mini apocalypse for that person. It's a mini apocalypse for that system. The people ruling there, the systems they had, the social networks are completely disrupted. It is like just a series of these hitting the entire region and just cascading one after another in such a way that it leaves an even more noticeable footprint than any of the previous ones. At the moment in which this is about to happen, the late 13th century, the early 1200s, what does the Mediterranean look like? As we talked about before, Assyria is in a heightened position. They've defeated the Mitanni, they are pushing against the Hittites. They seem to be one of the rising powers of the era. The Hittites have lost some territory to them, but they have not so long ago fought the Battle of Kadesh. They have severe influence over the Levant. They have contact with the Aegean and with the Mycenaeans in Greece. Egypt has competed with the Hittites, and they're still a massive power, one of the oldest, most centralized in the entire region. The Kassites are in somewhat of a decline, but as all of this goes on, these various powers are engaged in vast webs of diplomacy and trade and interconnectivity. This is a time dominated by great powers. There are a handful of massive powers, the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, and there are smaller ones that are often either trading partners or rivals or rebels or vassals. You have this big network that in some ways seems fairly modern. And yet, within half a century of this, you have the entire system turned upon its head. The Hittites more or less disappear. The Mycenaeans are replaced. Their old culture collapses into itself. The Assyrians are reduced to a rump state before they can begin a resurgence. The Kassite dynasty is replaced entirely. Egypt survives, but their treasuries are depleted. They have to turn internally once more. The entire world is shaken up, and it sets the stage for a completely different set of players to take the stage.
This event, this apocalyptic event in some ways, is known as the Bronze Age collapse. And it's called that for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, it's a general decline or collapse of civilization in the Bronze Age. But it also represents sort of a transitional state, because once civilization in the region recovered from this, we're no longer in the Bronze Age. We're firmly in the Iron Age after that. If you listeners are anything like me, and my educational experiences, some of you might not even know this term. That's the thing. The Bronze Age collapse is this hugely significant event which radically alters the course of some civilizations and radically restructures social, political, and economic systems throughout the Near East. And yet, I had never even heard the term until I was a junior in my college. And even then, only a single course, an ancient history course, obviously, taught by an old professor who loved his whiskey and long stories. He talked about the Bronze Age collapse and the significant transition that occurred after the Hittites. But even he only spared maybe 20 minutes on the subject during one of his lectures before we moved on to new topics. It fascinates me and kind of discourages me in a way that there are things like this, these seminal events, these fantastical and those unbelievable events, which are just kind of brushed over and forgotten in the average course of teaching. That's one of the reasons we want to talk about it so much.
When I was in college, I remember only a very brief mention. In fact, trying to recall when, I'm not even sure which course it was in. But at the time, it was framed as a big mystery. The explanation always been the Sea Peoples. And the explanation for the sea people has always been a big shrug. It's like they came from a place, and there's a lot of theories about where. As time has passed, we've gotten more sophisticated. There's more theories. There are a handful, but it's a lot more explainable than it was in the day. Like back when I was looking at this, I remember going home and being like, oh, I'm really fascinated by who these sea peoples were. And I looked it up, and some of the theories I found people talking about was maybe they somehow migrated all the way from Britain. Maybe these were like British raiders who came to the Mediterranean Sea for some reason, or maybe they were from Atlantis.
So what is the collapse, and what's happening beyond the obvious? As we talked about earlier, the approximate date we can give is between the years 1200 to around 1150 BCE. This happens in different places at different times, and we're still not exactly sure the precise chronology of events. Civilizations across the Mediterranean basin and beyond begin to experience catastrophe, decline, and in some cases complete collapse. The actual effects, the observable effects historically and archaeologically, are pretty interesting, pretty straightforward, but also pretty stark. Civilizations like the Hittites in Anatolia, the Mycenaeans throughout the Greek mainland and the Aegean islands, and also various civilizations throughout the Levant and Canaan and Syria, they virtually vanish. They collapse into almost nothing. The Greeks in particular go down into an extremely low level of culture and technology. The Hittites sort of survive this in a very limited state, but their history, their civilization, their influence is basically over. States like Assyria, Egypt, Elam, to a lesser extent Kassite Babylon, these states don't go into this sheer level of collapse, but even they will go into severe declines. When Egypt gets bankrupted, it has to focus inwardly, its empire beyond the Nile collapses, and it never really recovers. In fact, fortunately for Egypt, the oldest, most powerful civilization in the region, it's all downhill from here, just one wave of conquerors after the next, really up until the really modern period and the revolt from the Ottomans. Even the British were kind of, hi guys, we'd like to do some business. But you don't want to do business, we've got guns. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Yeah, those states survive, but they go into decline. As I mentioned, Greek civilization virtually collapses into what is often called the Dark Age of Greece, a time in which cities are abandoned, literacy is lost, and it becomes an age of legends and myths and murky stories recorded in later periods. The Hittites, as I said, break apart and also virtually collapse. A few rump states do emerge. These are sometimes called the Neo-Hittite or Hittite-Syrian kingdoms and the like. Well, these will have some significance for groups like the Phoenicians and others later, but they're more or less a faded remnant of the glory that once was. In the wake of these declines, new peoples are also going to migrate into this region in increasingly large numbers. And a lot of these groups who are taking advantage of this power vacuum are going to become some pretty major players down the road. For example, the Aramaeans, a group which was well known before this, but had mostly been confined to the Mediterranean coast, begin a massive migration all throughout this region, and both Aramaic as a language, but also the Aramaean peoples become very significant in the next phase of Mesopotamian history. Groups like the Phrygians, the Sumerians, which you readers might know this. Oh, wasn't Conan the Barbarian a Sumerian? Yeah, Howard do some pseudo-history as well. The Lydians, Urartans, and others will establish outposts in Turkey, and kingdoms like Lydia will actually be quite significant to Greek history in coming centuries. Groups like the Colchians and the Scythians moved to the Caucasus regions in Eastern Europe, and both those groups will also play a role in both Persian and Greek history in times to come. The Persians themselves, along with their cousins the Medes and the Parthians, will move into the Iranian plateau during this period. There's also historical accounts in the past talking about people like Dorians who migrate or invade Greece during this period of time. Most modern historians are more convinced that the Dorian migration occurred much later, probably up to a century after the collapse, and it more represents a small subgroup of Greek speakers moving around in the wake of this collapse, an actual invasion and a new civilization emerging, but it might as well be, given how radically Greek culture does shift after these events. But as my co-host here has intimated previously, one of the great questions is why? What causes this drastic turn of events to occur so quickly, so suddenly, and so catastrophically? Still, even though it is something of a mystery exactly what happened, there is a great deal of evidence, and out of these, a number of different theories have emerged. The oldest, and for a long time most popular, the so-called sea peoples, these sort of sea raiders or land raiders in some cases who came and just sort of pillaged and burned everything. Another theory is environmental change, whether that be climate change, whether that be famine and drought, soil fertility disruptions, all kinds of issues of population increases. Basically, a general collapse of environmental factors led to famine and ultimately a major collapse of civilization in itself. Also potentially combined with natural disasters like droughts, floods, earthquakes, and all kinds of nasty events. We've got a theory that a new age of cheap warfare was emerging, thanks to the spread of iron technology, which allowed for mass combat, invasions, and things of that nature to occur. This sort of combines a little with the Sea People theory as well. But the newest theory is called general system collapse. Basically, this highly integrated, highly centralized and structured system simply came apart at the seams. And when that system collapsed, civilization simply couldn't survive without it.
So on the topic of natural disasters, that seems to be the main precursor event. It seems to be likely what sparked much of this. In the era directly leading up to this, we have the evidence of dry events, of droughts throughout the region. A theory from pushed since the 1960s is that the Greek civilization essentially incurred a massive drought, and its civilization there, the Mycenaean civilization, they underwent such dramatic struggle from this that it collapsed and then spread. That event has now been somewhat corroborated as there have been soil samples taken from a variety of regions throughout the area where they have discovered that there's less pollen, there's probably less rainfall, it was probably drying up and becoming far more arid. That means you have less drinking water to go around, you have less water for your crops, you have less yields, and as that affects the entire region, areas that rely upon trade, who may have been exporting a large amount of grain from areas like Mesopotamia and Egypt, might have to rely even more heavily on that. But Mesopotamia and Egypt might also be experiencing the same exact effect. This would lead to a generalized rise in food prices and a generalized scarcity.
And there is some actual textual evidence for this as well. It's not as widespread, but there are a number of letters, Hittite letters, Mesopotamian letters, even a few Egyptian letters, which indicate that there are shortages in regions. They don't name drought usually, but this does seem to line up pretty neatly with these various environmental factors we found.
Going hand in hand, drought is famine. We have letters from Ugari in Syria or Levant that indicate that starvation and suffering are widespread throughout the region, and there is similar evidence that the famine was ongoing actually in Syria.
What makes this perhaps even more devastating to the region is that this dry event, which is certainly massively impacting crop yield and certainly helping to drive famine, is really only one more disaster on top of ongoing disasters. In previous episodes, we mentioned things like soil fertility problems Mesopotamia was having. And Mesopotamia and Egypt both have to be very careful of things like flood levels, which should refertilize their soil in drought periods. That's not happening as often or as consistently. Salinization due to poor irrigation techniques, major problem in the Babylonian period, still a problem there after this. And the fact that we know, and based on various accounts and records and archaeological evidence, that populations in this region were continuing to grow, which would have meant more press upon farmers to cultivate more land, to cultivate it more intensively, and of course that only further accelerates the degradation of soil and crop yields. Throw a drought on top of that, you have a pretty nasty recipe for disaster.
But all of this is still relatively the same pattern seen before. These droughts come, these famines happen, empires go, empires fall, but no collapse is quite as big. One of the big differences, however, is we now are dealing with civilizations, not just in Mesopotamia, but civilizations built along fault lines, specifically the Hittites and the Mycenaeans, and to some degree Syria as well. And it seems to be earthquakes that played a massive factor in this collapse. In this era, the largest city of the Greeks, Mycenae, was built on active fault, and it was more or less torn apart by at least one massive quake, maybe multiple. Troy 6 also shows devastation from earthquakes, and Ugarit, the city in Syria, also appears to have suffered from multiple earthquakes. How do we tell that these are earthquakes? Well, in some events, the walls are literally jarred out of place, and they're kind of displaced against one another. It's like the sidewalks you see in California being pulled apart all of a sudden, and the fences and whatnot. More than that, we find bodies dead not from arrows, not from stabs, but from having rocks fall on them. So in these events, it looks as though these cities were having major parts of their infrastructure torn up, having people crushed, These earthquakes would have done a significant amount of damage and could have easily weakened the defenses, might have devastated the temples. People in the cities may have had less trust in the, say, priests for giving the proper sacrifice. So there's all sorts of events that might have come from this. The cities that do survive, however, are repaired in the wake of this. So some of them do survive, but there are others that are just outright abandoned after earthquakes. Why this is so significant at this moment? Because surely there may have been some earthquake events at some portion earlier in Greek or Hittite history. This is something that they call an earthquake sequence, or referring to this era, they sometimes specifically use the term earthquake storm. The idea behind it is that a fault line will build up tons and tons and tons of pressure over more or less a long period with no quakes. And then once that pressure becomes great enough, it will eventually slip, release a large amount of it, but not all of it. And over the course of months, years, maybe even decades, it continues to release little by little in a sequence of pretty devastating earthquakes until it finally gets out of its system and builds up again. Instead of a continuous flow of disaster, this area might have underwent a fairly short window of devastation one after another. These natural disasters occur. Famine, drought, lead to likely very high food prices, likely lead to instability, trade disruption, all sorts of problems. Mixed in with earthquakes and shortages, you then have a situation where these cities could be very weakened, treasuries could be depleted, manpower could be low, and faith in the government could be an all-time rock bottom. Into this comes a wave of violence. It seems to start in Greece and then move beyond.
So as we said, Mycenaeans are where it all starts. That's the civilization in the late Bronze Age in Greece. And Mycenaean civilization, which obviously ancient Greek history is its own episode in its own way, but essentially the Mycenaeans had very closely copied the centralized city-state model that most major Near Eastern civilizations like the Babylonians and Assyrians and Hittites are using. Large palaces, warlords, grand cities, trade networks, all that stuff. At this time, we see evidence of violent warfare occurring, cities being plundered, burned, sacked. The vast majority are abandoned completely after this. Now, not all. There are some cities like Athens which are still occupied after this. A lot of cities either are abandoned completely or go into such severe decline you can't even call them cities anymore after this. Now, what happened there? We don't entirely know. Obviously, some kind of warfare occurred, but the Mycenaeans historically were an incredibly volatile and warlike people who warred with each other and plundered each other's trade routes and launched wars against their foreign neighbors as well. They weren't exactly a peaceful group. This could be internal fighting, it could be revolt. Perhaps massive slave revolts occurred in the wakes of these natural disasters. Perhaps massive wars that sprung up as cities hoped to reclaim resources and treasure from their neighbors. Telling to note that in the years leading up to these violent burning events, you do see the Greeks, the Mycenaeans, begin to increasingly fortify their cities. So-called Cyclopean walls, massive fortified walls and watchtowers begin to be constructed, which had been known before this, but there's a lot more being built now. A lot of them are on the sea. They're fortifying their coastlines. They're establishing watchtowers on the coast. Now, the Mycenaeans were a seagoing people, so that doesn't preclude inter-Greek warfare. But given the fact that we know from other accounts in the Near East that there were seagoing pirates and raiders who were attacking towns, it's an awfully suspicious coincidence. Unfortunately, no comprehensive written records have emerged out of Greek lands which really tell us one way or the other. All we know is disaster strikes. You get evidence of drought, evidence of earthquakes. Suddenly, a massive wave of violence occurs along the coast. Cities are burned and abandoned, and these large centralized civilizations and governments are simply no longer tenable or viable, and Greek life reverts into a very basic pattern of small villages and subsistent agriculture. This is also the period in which the so-called Dorian invasion or migration, at least according to centuries later Greek accounts, is supposed to have occurred, though again that's probably more of a moving and mixing of peoples inside of Greece. While old cities are being abandoned and new ones are not being built, we do know population shifts around inside the peninsula, and also large numbers flee to the islands and the coast of Turkey.
Next door to the Greeks, the Hittite Empire had begun to undergo a period of decline. They had warred with Assyria. Assyria had claimed some of their copper reserves to the west, They fought at Kadesh, and while they kept the city, they were unable to decisively defeat the pharaoh. And as we've seen before in Hittite history, they have a tendency to war with their neighboring tribes as resources became more scarce. As pressure was applied upon the trade lines, the Hittite Empire had a tendency to contract and collapse. And so, as Mycenae is going through this violent upheaval, as the Greeks are experiencing these famines, these earthquakes, these perhaps airmen fighting, perhaps pirate raids, the same thing seems to be happening to Hittite lands. It's possible that these Greeks undergoing such a catastrophic situation essentially fled their lands, either fleeing from raiders or hardship or destroyed cities. Perhaps they came as raiders to the Hittite lands, and the Hittites seemingly were undergoing the same problem, the same drought. They had to import grain from Egypt, and their treasuries were being depleted. A number of cities along the southern coast of Anatolia are sacked, seemingly by these seagoing people. The Egyptians would certainly claim that the sea peoples who they later fought were responsible for the destruction of the Hittites and other peoples in the region. But also the capital Hattusa is often attributed to sea people, despite the fact it's fairly inland. In fact, Hattusa seems a much more likely candidate for being sacked by the Casca people, the peoples from those hill tribes, the northern Anatolians who they fought for many years. It's likely that as Mycenaean Greece was undergoing this period of decline, as their people were migrating, as possible more of my people were migrating out of different regions, Hittites were dealing with an economic situation unsustainable as they were having these pressures applied on them. And in the wake of the earthquakes, one city after another was unable to defend itself. Hattusa falls, likely the Casca, the people along the coast fall to the sea people, and all of a sudden, not only are these trade lines severed, but the armies of the Hittites are defeated, the cities are plundered, the vassal kings are in disarray, and the situation is completely beyond recovery.
Some of the best evidence of this seagoing raid activities and source of the destruction of these cities actually comes from a letter from the Syrian city of Ugarit, which was one of the vassal states to the Hittite Empire. And in a letter we have, which is actually a copy of the original letter, says, quote, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. 7 ships of the enemy came here and inflicted much damage upon us."
Also in this era, you have the island of Cyprus, which was essentially a vassal state to the Hittites, being taken over directly. The Hittites sent an army there to command the forges, and in the midst of this collapse, it seems as though they had essentially taken vast supplies of copper products, weaponry, and buried it. Seemingly they had hoped to return someday and recover it, and it makes you wonder what the situation was. The army stationed there is producing arms, likely so they can raise more armies, and they had hoped, it seemed, to go to Anatolia, fight these armies, defend their cities, repulse the sea people, and then return to Cyprus. But that never happened. The sea people, or whomever was fighting the Hittites at that time, whomever that army had to face, either destroyed them or rendered the situation untenable, rendered the reason for returning to Cyprus moot in the first place. The next region, Canaan and Levant, that area was still divided between the Hittites and the Egyptians. Kingdoms which were at times vassals, at times rivals, inhabited the region. In the wake of Kadesh, the same generalized problems occur here. The cities suffer from lack of grain, earthquakes, internal damage. What seems to follow is noticeable invasion, almost certainly from the sea people throughout this region. Many of the attacks, when the cities were destroyed in the Levant, actually seem to fall between 2 different periods in which the Egyptians claimed to have fought a large sea people army. The peoples moving through the Canaan region appeared to have devastated a number of the cities there. There were a number of large cities, Ugarit being one of them, that in this period see abandonment and they shrink. And the people who would later inhabit these areas seem to be different. They seem to have somewhat different culture. This is a period, actually, when you see several cultures emerge, such as in the aftermath of the collapse, the Israelites, who some scholars theorize essentially took advantage of this period. Either this was roughly the period in which they were arriving in Canaan, or they had been sort of highland tribes who perhaps had broken away from the Canaanites and were sort of rivals of them. In the wake of this collapse, these cities were devastated, and foreigners, such as perhaps the Philistines, moved into the region, and the Egyptian control waned, and the Israelites were able to move, if this was the case, out of the highlands and perhaps into those cities. Wherever the specific details, though, cities like Ugarit, like Hazor, like Aleppo, Damascus, those areas are devastated. The foreign powers are broken. The people who had these areas in their sway, the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Mitanni before them, are basically unable to exercise the same degree of power in this region. What results in this region is not only a generalized destruction, these cities devastated, it's basically a complete rewriting of who's in power. Seemingly the Israelites rise and seize areas there. The Philistines sell the areas along the coast south of them. In the north, the Syro-Hittites will eventually emerge out of it. But in the interim period, there's more or less a complete reshuffle. Which, interestingly enough, if you are familiar with the Old Testament, there is actually a lot of anti-Egyptian messaging throughout, even beyond the Exodus story. It is possible, I would venture a guess, that if the Israelites were moving into these areas, were establishing themselves at this period, contesting these sort of remnant Egyptian forces and these vassal kings, and maybe even these Philistines who might have actually been mercenaries of the Egyptians in later areas, this might have been seen as a sort of direct attempt by foreign powers to impose themselves on what the Israelites perhaps viewed as their homelands, and sort of the myths of why they hated Egypt so much can maybe be explained somewhat by them actually taking these areas over, these areas that had been so wealthy in the lowlands where these massive cities have been built, and for centuries has essentially been at the bidding of the various pharaohs of the Nile. If all these events are sounding fairly similar, there's a reason. It's because these attacks, these famines, these whatever, keep happening in the same place, at the same time, and we don't actually have that many surviving records from most of these regions. There are the letters, but there's no big collection of stories of this, then this happened, then this happened, then we won this war, and here were the peoples, except in one location. And that location is Egypt. Leading up to this period, Egypt actually did have a little bit better fortune than others. If you remember from the last episode, Egypt exported large amounts of grain to the Hittites. They had the breadbasket of the Nile, and even though they confirm in this era having less sort of replenishment from the Nile's flooding, they still were such a big breadbasket they weren't starving. They were actually able to export it, and while they were exporting grain to the Hittites were essentially exporting material back to the Egyptians, whether it be tin, whether it be their own work bronze, whether it be entirely different. And that meant that while Egypt was feeding the other nations, it was becoming more wealthy. It was actually, in a way, preparing for what was about to come by bolstering its own strength and sort of consolidating in the buildup to the Sea People.
The earliest account we have out of Egypt actually comes from the reign of Ramses II. And this quote, or this inscription, I should say, one of the primary sources is called the Tanis Stele, basically seems to predate most of these events. In fact, by some accounts, might even predate the Battle of Kadesh itself. According to his account, he fought marauders from the sea and defeated them, and some of them may have even changed sides and served in his armies.
The specific people they mention here are the Sherdan. The Sherdan appear in multiple other ones, I believe in both the other two great battles that the Egyptians have with the Sea People. And the Sherdan are noted pretty frequently as being one of the ones specifically from the sea. Not all of them are always referenced to coming from the sea, but they do. It seems as though Sherdan may have been the first this wave of raiders, sea peoples. Perhaps they were a seaborne raiding force, some theorize out of Sardinia, and they likely would have attacked the Nile region, perhaps other regions, and through defeating them, Ramses II likely either then paid them off to fight in his army rather than fight against him, or perhaps defeated them so thoroughly he was able to give them the choice between more or less fighting as slave soldiers or indentured soldiers or death. Whatever the case, though, he seemed to record that they were warriors at Kadesh, and not only warriors, but they were among his generals. One of them was the one that came up with the plan to split his army into 4 divisions when it marched. The next inscription we have from Egypt is actually shortly before the attacks in Ugarit in Syria. The pharaoh Merneptah fought a confederation of people who they refer to as the 9 Bows. Strangely, this actually seems to be a sort of Egyptian term that they would use to refer to foreign peoples, or at times collections of foreign peoples who would align and attack Egypt. So it doesn't seem to have been a name they would have used for themselves. It was instead a name used by the Egyptians to refer to a foreign invading force. But this group of the people of the 9 Bows seemingly were involved with Libyans who had been raiding along Egypt this time. They may have even been led by the Libyans, either a king or a raider chieftain or something like that. But among those who did come, those who were often equated with Sea People in this era and later's, are the Ekwesh, the Luka, the Shekelesh, the Sherdan, and the Teresh. Not only did these people arrive as raiders and attack Egypt, they actually arrived as an entire army, and they arrived with a large baggage train, with also their families. The aim of these people seemingly was not simply to raid Egypt, not simply to burn their cities, but if they were bringing all their families, all these camp followers, they may have wished to conquer Egypt and sell it the way the Hyksos did. The Egyptians later claim that that is the motivations of sea peoples who arrive after the destruction of Ugarit, but we're not entirely sure. This does seem to be one of the largest battles, however. After the Egyptians repulse them, they account the dead as 6,000, and they claim 9,000 prisoners. About 30 years after this clash, however, another group attempted to invade Egypt. Ramses III's mortuary temple claimed that he had to fight not one, but two battles against these people. The first was a rather large land invasion bound from the Syrian lands, heading through the Levant and toward the Sinai, and with its end goal being the Nile Valley itself. The inscriptions from the temple read, "The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. From Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia on, being cut off at one time. A camp was set up in Amuru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming forward toward Egypt, while flame was prepared before them. Their confederation was Pelset, Tejeker, Shekelesh, Dinyan, and Wishesh, lands united. They laid their hands upon the land as far as the circuit of the earth, their hearts content and trusting, our plan will succeed." Like the previous invasion, this seems not to have simply been warriors. They seem to have brought whole hosts of non-combatants and families behind them. And in this battle, the Egyptians fought them in Syria, eventually turned them back, and their peoples who were settled along the eastern fringes of the empire, in the areas of Canaan, perhaps along the Sinai. Most likely what would have happened, these people would have had the end goal of either raiding and either moving on past Egypt or actually selling there. The Egyptians would have stopped them, fought them, and supposedly they just fled. The survivors who fled the battle abandoned their bags to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians, when faced with either the option of executing all of these families, all these non-combatants, and the soldiers who remained in mass, or actually saying, well, we can provide for some of your needs, we can actually feed you, assuming you uphold this fringe of the empire, it seemed like a win-win when Egypt was actually coming under a second attack. Because after the fight at Syria, Ramses III claims he had to return to the Nile Valley and repulse a second invasion, this one seaborne. The navy of these people, perhaps led by the Sheridan, who were noted sailors, the seaborne invasion attempted to enter Egypt, the pharaoh being unwilling to engage them on the open seas, instead lured them into the Nile River, and the strategy appears to have been to more or less take the center, divide them, and actually force them up against the coast, the banks of the river, because stationed on the banks of the river, as well as in their own ships, were Egyptian archers. So forcing them there allowed them to be in a crisscross fire of multiple directions, and any ships there beached or overturned, or simply perhaps maybe trying to land and flee, were, the pharaoh claims, taken down and killed by the soldiers there on the banks. With this sea invasion defeated, likely some survivors may have fled back to the Mediterranean, back to their camps, and continued raiding. A surviving papyrus scroll from the reign of Ramses IV, the son of Ramses III, who engaged in these battles, claims that after these victories, the pharaoh actually did engage in counterattacks, claiming he slew the Dinyan in their isles, and that they burned the Tejeker and the Pelset. The papyrus also mentions that in addition to some of those forces settled in the areas like Canaan, like the Pelset, that during his era he also settled the Sheridan, the Wishesh, and the pharaoh was even called the king of the nine bows in this era, perhaps co-opting the idea of this confederation and saying that he had become the king of this confederation by bringing the various marauding forces who had sought to attack Egypt and use them to actually hold back other marauders in the borders. In fact, the scroll actually mentions that there are foreign mercenaries living amongst their families in garrison towns on borders. Did this represent just the Egyptians co-opting these people, convincing them to accept some tribute, the grain perhaps they were seeking after leaving these famine-ravaged lands in order to guard the borders? Perhaps instead these were areas that were already settled by the Philistines or whomever had taken over the cities in their stead, and the Egyptians were perhaps putting a coat of paint on saying that we settled them. Not so much, we agreed to stop fighting because we can't get them out of the city. Who knows? It's likely it could have been either. It could have been that some were more pro-Egyptian, some were more anti-Egyptian. It's unknown at this time, but certainly these are people who the Egyptians are dealing with. instead of just being a marauding force who show up to destroy these civilizations, they're selling the areas around it, the Egyptians are using their services. They're very familiar with the old Kassite-Amorite sort of story. The ones, however, settled in the regions of Canaan, the one the pharaoh says would now garrison the borders of his empire, were specifically the Jeker, the Pelset, and the Denians. The Pelset are believed to be the Philistines. There's a lot of connections between them, and they think that some of the dress and pottery style simply resembles Greek styles, and so it could have been that they were a Greek people had come, and the name Pelset and Philistine do have some similarities, and the area that the biblical Philistines inhabited was sort of south of Israel, the area that bordered between them and the Egyptian-controlled lands.
And this is probably a coincidence, but in the classical age of Greece, the term peltast, very similar, was used to refer to a soldier who was a light raider and skirmisher in battle.
Which might have been a very new and decisive way that these battles were fought at the time. The Denians perhaps may also have been Greek, and some theorize that they may have become the tribe of Dan, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, one that notably had coastal provinces. The third group among them, the Jeker, are in the Bible referenced to be a group originally from Crete, and seemingly they were. They may have actually been a group originally from the mainland of Greece who, after the trouble there, migrated to Crete, or originally came from Crete. At some point in between, had actually went to Anatolia, and given the fact that Anatolia did not end up being much improved, eventually immigrated to the area of Canaan. These were seemingly people who had kept hopscotching all around the region until they found somewhere relatively stable enough to actually make a living.
But it is important to note that there is not exactly consensus, but definitely some thought among modern historians that these accounts by both Ramses III and Ramses IV might not be the most accurate. To begin with, it's hard to know if these were actually the names of these groups, names the Egyptians used. But on top of that, it's noted that pharaohs had a tendency to over-exaggerate their achievements, occasionally to outright lie or fabricate. Again, Ramses II claimed a total crushing victory over the Hittites, and while he could claim to have done well against them, he certainly didn't defeat them. Also, we'll go further back, guys like Sekhen and Ra, who claimed to defeat the Hyksos, and almost certainly killed by them. It's important to take these things with a grain of salt. These battles probably occurred, but were they as massive as the pharaohs claim? Were their victories quite as decisive, or, as we already said, did they, slap a coat of paint over what really happened to make it look better than it actually was? So it's an important thing to keep in mind.
There's some indication that Ramses III might have even been trying to dress up some of his more minor battles by directly making them look like the previous Clash of the Sea People. So even if the first one was near in scale, maybe the second one wasn't quite. During this time, with the various invasions, the Libyans seem to have been involved. Raiders and tribes coming out of the eastern fringes, the eastern borders of the Egyptian civilization, seem to have been arriving, trying to test the borders of Egypt, trying to raid them, etc., etc. And many times either were an organizing force or supporting force or an allied force to Sea People. After the Sea People attacks had ceased, after whatever confederation was disrupted and went back to small-scale piracy, the Libyan raids continued and the Egyptians had to contend with them. In between the Libyan attacks and the Sea People campaigns, Egypt seems to have went into a period of decline in this area. The famine did eventually come to Egypt. In the decades that followed Ramses III, Ramses IV through IX, the sons of Ramses III actually, they seem to have fought for power, one place and the other. It actually went son, grandson, son, grandson, son, grandson. Seemingly one took power, put his son on the throne, and the uncle would overthrow him. Very familiar story from the Hittites. But grain production decreased, the power and prestige of the pharaoh crumbled, and the state shrank. The Asiatic possessions in Canaan and whatnot became less and less and had to be staffed by foreign mercenaries, and they lost their holdings in Nubia and further along the Nile. This does mark the end of the New Kingdom. They are now in the third intermediate period. The building projects are not as large, and Egypt at this point basically is hit its height. It will never again return to sort of the massive building projects of the early dynasties or the massive imperial expansion of the later dynasties.
But all of this really begs an important question. Who are the Sea? Where do they come from? Why do they do this? Where did they go? Because they seem to vanish into history as mysteriously as they appear in some cases. Even the term Sea People is a very generic word. The Egyptians use it. The Hittites talk about the land people and the sea people. A lot of groups, again, like the Hittites and a few others, are using very generic words. For example, some Hittite records refer to these groups as wanderers. They literally use the word wanderer. But they also apply that to the Aramaean tribes and the Hurrian tribes and a bunch of other groups who are also migratory peoples who probably weren't the most peaceful in their expansion, but wouldn't be considered part of this Sea People race. The Egyptians actually give names to, I believe, 9 different groups in their various invasions. Some of those terms we think we can link to groups. Others are well known. For example, the Luca, who are mentioned by the Egyptians. Well, the Luca River Valley region in western Anatolia. The Hittites mention it frequently throughout their history of warring with the hill tribes of the Luca lands. Are they referring to the same group, or is it just a word the Egyptians are using because, they've heard there are these fierce raiders out in Anatolia called the Luca? It could be either one. You see this situation where we have these groups, probably very disparate and scattered groups, who are pillaging and raiding and engaging in these wars and maybe these epic battles. We're not exactly certain what the shape would look like. So a lot of questions over who these people actually are. And unfortunately, the records we do have aren't always the most comprehensive sources.
So we consider that the Egyptians might have been embellishing, that the Hittite records and the Greek records and the Ugarit records aren't the most detailed, that we're not sure who everyone is, what exactly happened. What do we know? What can we say for sure that the records indicate happened? It seems that in this period of weakness, spurred on by the various natural disasters we've talked about, raiders struck the coastlines in large numbers. Cities for sure were burned and abandoned in many regions, and places when they rebuilt further inland, and they looked for more defensible areas. While these attacks happened, there were numerous regional kings who sought help from allies, from their overlords, but seemingly every other ruler in the region was unable to respond because they were also dealing with brutal natural disasters and attackers, or possibly even internal violence, or internal and external violence at the same time. The city of Ugarit, where multiple earthquakes had weakened it previously, they sent many letters out asking for assistance, talking about the violence that occurred, the raids that happened. We find the city was violently sacked. There are bodies in the streets, and there are arrowheads in those bodies and embedded in the walls. This was a place that, in addition to everything else, the famine, the starvation, the collapses, people came there and killed en masse and either burned or took what they had. These sea raiders could have been pretty significantly destabilizing on a very wide scale and cultural level. Sea raiders on that level, during that time of instability and governmental weakness, could mean that cities and settlements were entirely open to attack. The raiders could choose when to attack and where to attack. They could choose the most opportune targets, and they could choose the best time to engage. With that in mind, everywhere becomes vulnerable. You never know when you're safe. And as these battles continue, and as perhaps warfare becomes more widespread and stuff like cheaper skirmisher units are being used in mass, you have these continuous wars, these continuous violent episodes would very likely have led to a sort of depopulation of the noble ranks. Like it happened in the Kassite lands when the Assyrians and Elamites had captured the various nobles and the king and taken them in chains, and others had died in fights. You essentially have a ruling class that is very quickly losing their warrior aristocracy, and they're losing the ability to actually field those chariots and fight like they used to. And all of a sudden, when these states no longer have this elite professional corps, they don't command the power, they don't command the respect they once had, and you have, in the face of everything else, in the face of all these natural disasters, a violent expansion, or at least a violent raiding by people against states which formerly could have stopped them, and in the face of all this are simply unable to do so.
In a general sense, we're fairly confident that the reason this whole thing started probably is, again, those same natural disasters that was wrecking civilization. Wherever the Sea People came from, and there are numerous potential origin points, in fact, multiple origin points might be possible and maybe likely. In times of famine and crisis and disaster, it's not unheard of for civilizations to take to the road or take the sea in hopes to find greener pastures elsewhere, or to, at the very least, take what they want, the sword in hand. And there are numerous hypotheses about where the Sea People might have come from. One of the most popular explanations is, well, they came from Greece. And a lot of theories come to that. For example, the idea that the Philistines, who were reasonably confident were originally one of the Sea People groups, there's a good chance they might have come from Greece. We can't say for certain what part of it, but there's evidence of it. In addition to this, when the Mycenaeans, who again were very aggressive and warlike civilization, were conquering the Aegean Islands, they would have displaced large numbers of the previous Minoan civilization. Perhaps remnants of that group struck out, putting them in displaced in their homes. Maybe since the Mycenaeans were so busy killing each other, survivors fled Greece with their ships and their arms and their families in tow. Or maybe it was the remnants of the Trojan War which was being fought in this period. Either it's Greeks who are wandering, perhaps a vague origin for the myth of Odysseus, or maybe it's the Trojans who are displaced at the end of this. Unfortunately, we can't know, but given the kind of upheaval we did see in Greece, it's reasonable, in fact, that maybe the Sea People are displaced Greek warriors, given both the Greek penchant for seafaring and, in this era, their extreme love of warfare. It would make a certain degree of sense.
Scholars have known that, there are certain kilt styles and headdress styles which have similarity, and the Philistine pottery in the era after this, they say, has definite markers of Mycenaean style. So it definitely seems there's a material culture of the Greeks among the Sea People. And, as we mentioned before, the Tajekar supposedly came from Crete and then moved around a few regions. Perhaps those were some remnant of a previous Minoan civilization group.
The next other theory that actually does seem fairly reasonable was the so-called Anatolian famine hypothesis. This hypothesis basically states that, given the fact that Anatolia and the Hittites and the surrounding areas are hit very hard by earthquakes, famines, and droughts, other various natural disasters, that maybe the violence and upheaval and destruction of cities there isn't the result of seaborne raiders from outside, so much as civil unrest, civil war, upheaval occurring there. And some of these displaced groups might take to the sea and then raid coastal areas, or go by land as the Egyptians indicated. One of the first major battles fought by Ramses III was over land. Makes a certain degree of sense. These are civilizations like the Luca, for example, which are mentioned in Egyptian records, are a known group that lived in Anatolia at one time. They got this desperation and starvation, and also a long history of warfare and seafaring as well. Could have easily spawned, large, disparate, desperate groups seeking greener pastures. The Anatolians especially would have known that Egypt was a pretty green pasture. Another leading hypothesis is what I'm calling the Italian hypothesis. This basically indicates that at least some of the Sea Peoples may have come from either the Italian peninsula or more likely the islands surrounding it. In fact, in particular, it's thought that groups like the Sherden may have come from Sardinia and the Shekelesh from Sicily, again based on some linguistic similarities and also some other evidence in terms of appearances and pictures of that nature. Now, this is long before what we think of as classical Italian civilization. The Romans might have been around, but they would have been hill tribes living around the Tiber River in this period of time. So it would not have been the age of Italy that you might think of. And so we actually don't know a lot about what those early civilizations looked like. There is some material evidence which links at least some of these groups to those islands.
The Sherdan in particular, which are the group that are known to be the great sailors and some of the first raiders, if this was a migration, perhaps other people were more or less displaced from their homes. The Sherdan might have legitimately just been a raider culture who had heard the weakness has spread from Greece to the Hittites and on, and they came in mass.
From an inscription left by Pharaoh Ramses II, the unruly Sherdan, whom no one had ever known how to combat, they came boldly sailing in their warships from the midst of the sea, none being able to withstand them.
The Sherdan in the Egyptian depictions appear to wear horned helmets, and they appear to have rounded shields, these rounded indents that circle it. And the same items have been found on statues and goods and whatnot in Sardinia. So it seems very likely that culture had connection to Sardinia. Older scholarship believes that the Sherdan had arrived, they raided, they took their spoils, and then they went to Sardinia and sold it. More modern scholarship indicates that might have actually been the local culture, which was probably conducting some deal of trade, maybe some deal of small-scale piracy throughout many years, and in time had more or less become a more present force in the sea.
Of course, some people look at all these theories and say, yes, all of them are true. Essentially, this is called the global migration hypothesis. It basically states, if you look at a larger context of the Mediterranean basin and the Near East, there are a ton of people who are moving and migrating in this region. Again, the Aramaeans, the Persians, the Scythians, the Lydians. Maybe these various seafaring raiders are just, again, one more part of a much larger global movement of people. Maybe spurred on by this long dry period. Maybe spurred on by something else. It's an interesting idea, and it certainly seems to fit the facts, but unfortunately, it's hard to know exactly how all these migrations fit together, and that some of these groups come from very disparate regions. It's likely that the same thing wasn't driving all of them. So it's an interesting idea, and I think it actually has some weight of truth to it. It's just unfortunately that we just don't yet have quite enough evidence to really link it all together.
So whether it's global or regional, what might have been driving these sort of migrations, these invasions, these movements? It could have been that this famine, this drought had started in other regions, or simply was all hitting them at the same time. If you had people, say, in the northern areas of Anatolia, maybe also supplemented by people in the Black Sea region, if you've got people around Sardinia and Sicily, if these areas are suffering hardship, they might well have said, let's go look for greener pastures, and by the time they arrive at the intermediate places, Mycenae, Hittite lands, Levant, those places aren't quite as green, and you kind of have this process of moving on. It's perhaps possible that had some of these people been actually seeking lands to sell in, had they taken their families and said, we need to find somewhere else, that after each victory they fought, after each city they sacked, they realized the lands there were just not capable enough, and they moved on, and the survivors from those cities, probably not butchered in mass, may have picked up their possessions and followed along. It's possible that this may have started with that first wave of Sheridan, and after contacting the people in Anatolia and raiding them, perhaps they decided to join on. Perhaps after the Mycenaean Greeks suffered their most dramatic collapses, more of their people went looking for work, seeking employment as raiders because there's much fewer job prospects in Greece. But as one of my favorite shows, Rome, run on HBO, once said, men with swords never go hungry. If you look at an example like, say, Iraq, when the army was disbanded, you suddenly have a whole lot of guys with weaponry and the training and no real job prospects. The lure for banditry, the lure for joining warlord armies in this situation could be quite enticing. So all of a sudden, when these raiders hit your lands or earthquakes devastate them, that might be the only way that you see to actually survive, the only way you see to feed your kids, put money in your pocket, the only way to make a living, really, in this sort of tragic, violent era.
One old theory that tried to explain, well, how are these sea raiders, these disparate bandits, essentially, sea people, so effective? Obviously, we just talked about all kinds of other factors that, build into why these people were weaker. The old idea was, well, the sea peoples had iron. Maybe they had it themselves. Maybe they introduced technology, or perhaps they stole it from the Hittites, who were, in sort of myth and legend, said to be the originators of iron as a new material of choice. That's, unfortunately, an amusing story, but probably not true. Now, on the one hand, it's entirely likely that sea people had iron, because humans have been working with iron for a long time, usually meteoric iron. They weren't really digging out of the ground to a real degree. But secondly, the weird thing is, iron actually isn't so much better than bronze, honestly. Now, it can be. Iron, in general, is harder. A little bit. Bronze worker knows what he's doing. A good hammered bronze is almost as hard as iron. Now, iron is less likely to deform and bend when you hit something with it. It's less likely to lose its edge quickly. But again, it's not dramatically better. For example, steel is dramatically better than iron. Iron is not really dramatically better than bronze. The difference is, iron is cheap. Iron is plentiful and can be found all over the place. And unlike bronze, which needs to combine two relatively rare elements together in a very specific ratio, you purify your iron ore, you hammer it into shape, you've got a tool. It's pretty much that easy. It's still hard to work with. It needs much higher heat. In the ancient world, it couldn't be reliably melted or cast the way bronze could be in later periods. But again, the ability for anyone, even the Greeks, who have no natural sources of bronze, to dig it out of the ground in their homeland and make tools out of it, just makes it that much more economically valuable.
The crux of this theory is that if they had had iron, they could have had massive armies in comparison. Compare, say, the elite chariot forces, which were the equivalent of the knights, with their lifelong training, all their expensive weaponry, etc., to masses of people with javelins, masses of people with spears or slings or arrows. If you have enough people who have at least enough training to use those weapons, they can kill the horseless chariots. All of a sudden, you've got these men who are trained in a very specific type of warfare who can't use that warfare. And even if they're semi-successful, they take losses. If the sea people are a band that come over and over again, those losses are going to mount up to the point where you can't replace it, whereas it's not that hard to replace a man with a duffel bag full of javelins.
Another thing to consider is that while chariot warfare, the historical form of warfare in the Bronze Age, is very prestigious to do this, it's actually quite limited. Chariots need very specific battlefield conditions, some big open areas to function. While a light skirmisher army, they can fight in the streets of the city, they can fight on a ragged coastline, they can fight on the deck of a ship, they can fight in a forest or a mountain. They're cheaper, they're easy to train, they're way more flexible.
In later eras, when you actually have people breeding bigger horses and actually just riding the horses, you have a sort of compromise. You have all the advantages of being able to ride down troops, use impact warfare lances and thrown weapons, and you don't have the big, bulky, unmaneuverable chariots. I think a fairly good comparison as to why iron would have been such a big deal, why it would have changed so much, and why it was such a massive factor in the way things changed in the Iron Age. In warfare, a lot of things often come down to numbers. Weapon tech is sometimes important, morale and training are sometimes important, but a huge factor is how many soldiers can you put on the battlefield. Not only how much manpower you have, but how effectively can you equip them. How much money do you have to give them weaponry, and how much time does it take to train them. As I said, knights, chariots, that sort of thing, even later English longbowmen, they take a considerable amount of time to train, and they can be extremely effective. They're elite warriors. Pound for pound, they're some of the best warriors in the battlefield. But the difference becomes, when you look at the English longbowmen, what is the sort of response? It is largely crossbows. Crossbows are not really as effective as a big, heavy, traditional English longbow, but it's a lot easier to teach somebody. Cheaper to make one, and it's quicker for someone to become proficient with it. And then later, when you see the introduction of early firearms, those firearms are typically not nearly as accurate as bows and crossbows, sometimes not as deadly, and often far less quick until you actually have more advanced firearm technology, but those are extremely cheap. You essentially have a shaped piece of wood with a straight piece of metal with a hole bored through it, and you train someone to clear the breach, put the power in, put the bullet in, and fire. That revolutionized warfare because now it was extremely simple to take anyone and train them how to kill with it. In the same way, you could have taken this warfare in the Bronze Age, where it's about warrior elites with their chariots, with their training, with their big fancy way of doing things, transition it into skirmisher warfare, and later even things like the Greeks would do, where even if you didn't have the money to equip everyone with full sets of armors, full on hoplites, you could throw peasant militias with just spears in the ground.
A quote I heard once, which is really exaggerating the situation, though, but kind of sums it up, says, "It takes 10 years to train an archer, it takes 10 days to train a crossbowman, it takes 10 minutes to train a musketeer."
One last addendum to the talk of sea people, in addition to the tribes we mentioned and the raiders like the Sherdan, the various migratory people that resemble groups like the Elamites and the Gutians and the Sutians that we've talked about before, and Amorites and Kassites. In addition to all that, there is another possibility that we've mentioned briefly a couple times, and it's the fact that there may have been some pretty intense internal struggles, basically rebellions and violence happening within city-states, within nations and empires. The city of Tel Hazor in Canaan at this time was devastated. Traditionally, this has been attributed to the Sea People, or some believe the Israelites might have destroyed the city at this time. However, there is something strange about the city in comparison to many of the others. In the city of Tel Hazor, the temples and the palaces were burned. However, the portion of the city where people lived, the homes, the shops, the common areas, more or less untouched. It could have been possible that a group like the Israelites might have simply wanted to eradicate the ruling class and take over for themselves, but I think even more likely it's the possibility that, given this era, when you've got raiders at the door and you've got economic collapse, and yet you've got an opulent palace culture, a decadent almost temple culture where you have tithes and taxes and these big harems and sending tablets across the sea and importing lapis lazuli and tin from across the world. When you've got that mixed with the inability of people to feed their children in the streets, the soldiers perhaps who may be drawn somewhat from those people failing to repulse the sea peoples, contending with wanderers and nomads out of the deserts, it's possible that the people of these cities simply had enough of the ruling class in Tel Hazor. In fact, the major Greek city of Mycenae shows the majority of the damage was actually focused on the royal palace and the royal granaries. Were all of these examples of essentially the French Revolution happening amidst the Viking raids? Was it a case of the revolutions had further weakened the states and led to the Sea Peoples? Was it possible in the week of the Sea Peoples they figured, screw it, why are we still listening to this guy? He didn't protect us. Why are we still propping the system? Perhaps after a battle, some king or his nobles died and there was no one to stop them from raiding these places and stealing the grain to feed their kids instead of finance whatever it was the king wanted to do. These rebellions show basically a collapse of the order. In addition to all these other areas where this fighting is happening, When you see rebellions occurring as far spread as Mycenae down to the Canaanite lands and likely even over in the Kassite and Assyrian held territories at this time, indicates a generalized distrust of the system, generalized a sort of sense of being fed up with what occurred. The real question is what happens? Like when you have the king removed, when you have the palace culture more or less collapse and the system kind of taken out of disjuncture, there are no soldiers. There are no law enforcement, or if there are, they're not being paid. They're probably not showing up to work, or at least not in all regions. The basic services, post office, trade, record keeping, all that's uncertain, might be in complete disarray, might be made simply a trickle. The economy is out of whack. The amount of value you can hope for your goods, the stability you can hope for your profits, the safety you can hope for your home, it's all in question. When every aspect of your life is in question, there's little reason to put faith in the people in charge. And in fact, assuming the situation was as dire as it was, those people might already be dead. If you have no one leading the society, if you have a society that is essentially trying to pick up the pieces in the wake of this, you end up more or less with a dark age. In the wake of this, with all of the complex systems falling apart and the sea people attacking and the natural disasters just sowing chaos, you end up with just an entire way of life going away forever.
And so all of this sort of builds up into what we might call the final hypothesis as to what actually caused the Bronze Age collapse. And so far I've asked, was it the sea people? Was it environmental change? Was it an increase in the effectiveness or at least the scale of warfare? Was it a result of internal rebellion and revolt? Was it of all this? Well, the newest scholarship suggests that it's actually all of these things combined. That this is not, as most events in history are, this is not something that you can say, this one thing is the cause. It's actually a series of events that avalanches out of control. This is called system collapse theory. This particular type of interpretation is actually applied to a lot of things. Why did the Bronze Age collapse happen? Why did the Roman Empire fall? Why did the Soviet Union fall? A lot of it really comes down to what they call a system collapse theory. Essentially, it works like this. Any social system or political system or both has a certain degree of elasticity. Basically, systems can respond to crisis to a degree. The more flexible your system, the better it can respond. Now, how you define flexibility depends, but essentially what happens is this. The Bronze Age, whether you're talking about the Hittites, or the Egyptians, or the Kassites, or the Assyrians, or the Mycenaeans, or any other group we've named so far, all of them lived in a very centralized system. In other words, there was a lot of bureaucracy. There was very strict hierarchies of who's in charge of what, how is authority separated, who handles what, how is the army formed, how is trade handled, how is tax collected, how are people managed, how is law enforced. All of it was very strictly codified. And that had been for a long time a very significant advantage these civilizations enjoyed. This degree of centralization and this degree of bureaucratization had allowed them to more effectively exploit resources and become a much stronger civilization as a result. As I'm sure any of us who've dealt with any government agency know, bureaucracy has a tendency to stagnate and ossify and become less responsive and often less effective over time. It's just sort of the nature of the beast. Essentially, what we see here is, by around 1200 BCE or so, these systems have become very top-heavy. In other words, bureaucracies have grown, the leadership caste has grown to the point where it's no longer really necessary to have all these people doing these things. That's because things have specialized. You have people doing very specific tasks, and either by custom or by law, not allowed to step outside those tasks. Essentially, our department handles this. We don't handle that related thing. That's the guy down the hall. Again, if you've ever dealt with any government agency ever, you have some experience with this. Even school systems, you have some experience with this. Essentially what happened was, as these Bronze Age systems grew more centralized, more specialized, they became more unresponsive. In other words, less able to actually respond effectively to crisis, which means in a practical sense, they became more fragile. Even so, they could still handle a lot. Again, all kinds of disasters that occurred in previous periods we've mentioned. Suddenly, big things are happening. And this drought we talked about wasn't just a few years of no rain. This was an event that might have lasted just 3 centuries of slow desiccation in some regions. This wasn't just a couple of earthquakes, this was a storm of earthquakes that might have taken place over the course of years. Those are hard to deal with on their own. A system that's becoming unresponsive has a hard time dealing with that. When those same natural disasters and environmental conditions might have led desperate people to pick up the sword of surviving, and they start raiding your countryside, that's a disaster on top of a disaster. When you prove unable to manage the famine and defend your peoples, and they rise up against you, yet one more disaster on top of all things. And basically, it's not that one solid blow knocked out the Mycenaeans or the Hittite or anyone else. It's that a series of powerful blows hit them in succession, and ultimately, they're very old, very specialized, unfortunately very fragile socio-political systems simply could not absorb that punishment and shattered. And of course, that leads to perhaps the biggest danger of this kind of centralization, is that once the system broke, once the people in charge either die or flee or abandon their posts, once these systems of trade and tax collection and tribute and manufacturing and distribution and trade regulation fall apart, suddenly the very seams of society fall apart as well. Yeah, there's no one to regulate water usage and land use. There's no one to recruit and train soldiers to defend the borders. There's no one to regulate the importing of raw materials you need. There's no one to license guilds to manufacture tools and weapons and what have you. And so it becomes a scramble and a free-for-all. Greece is the best example of this. They reverted to a very primitive subsistence level of basically agriculture. Even the village chieftains were basically farmers working their own land because you had to revert to that level just to survive once everything is wiped away.
For all of the fragility of the system, for the complexity of it, and how much it had calcified and become unresponsible over the years, it was a system that had worked for centuries. For, well, if you take this era as essentially the post-Sargon, post-war era, for the last 1,000 years, this had more or less been building to a fairly successful system of great powers.
We've said that the period following the Bronze Age collapse is often referred to as either a Dark Age or the Dark Age, depending upon what you're studying, which gets confusing because there's a lot of periods called Dark Ages. Bronze Dark Age, or the Greek Dark Age, or the Hittite Dark Age, or call it. Why do we call it that? What does Dark Age even mean in this context? Well, it depends also on the historian. For example, some historians say, well, a Dark Age is an age in which literacy is either much reduced or even gone, and therefore there's either no or very few historical sources, and therefore it is dark in the sense that it is unknown or only lightly known. Others argue, no, it's a dark age because you see a general collapse in living conditions and standards of living and technology, and thus people are living in a less advanced, less quote-unquote enlightened time, and therefore it's a dark age for that reason. It's probably a little bit of both, plus other factors involved as well. Essentially, we call this period a dark age because, as mentioned, the complex social, political, and economic structures which allowed for extremely advanced civilizations and very wealthy civilizations and high standards of living unravel. Again, for a variety of reasons, they come apart. These Bronze Age civilizations pre-collapse are able to do things that post-collapse they can't do anymore. The highly centralized irrigation systems meant that fewer people could be farmers in Mesopotamia, therefore there were larger classes of people who could be merchants and scribes and scholars and artisans and what have you. But that system falls apart, suddenly more and more people have to take the land once again, and they simply want to survive because the complex systems that supported widespread agriculture aren't there anymore. In addition to this, things like the production of not just luxury goods, but all goods, the production of goods, keeping of records. Again, literacy is a very rare skill, and most scribes are government employees being taught this complex art for that reason. Out the systems of resource extraction to support groups like scribes and artisans and merchants, trade collapses. Production reduces to a primitive level, which I mean, you've either got to produce your own stuff for your own use, which often means you're using whatever you can produce, and most of us, that's not much. things reduce to a very primitive level. You make what you need to survive and nothing else, because either you have the time or the skills or the resources to do it. In a lot of regions, literacy does, if not die out, at least become an extremely uncommon skill, because again, in the Bronze Age, literacy was not something that was going to really aid your everyday survival all that much. To survive every day, you needed to know, how do I keep my crops healthy? How do I keep predators away from my animals? And how do I keep my neighbor from beating me over the head with a club and stealing everything I have? Being able to read the old epics wasn't going to help with any of those things, and so most people didn't bother to learn because there wasn't an advantage to it. And indeed, one could argue that it really isn't until the modern age in which literacy becomes an innate part of working and being able to do a lot of jobs that it becomes a skill that we'll need to have once again. And so the end result of literacy either dying out or at least regressing to a minor point is that people don't pass on the stories. People don't pass on the scholarship. So within a few generations, knowledge dies out. Heck, within 2 generations, knowledge can die out. To give this a sort of twist of a modern example, if society were to end tomorrow, how many of you could build and program a computer from scratch? I think very few of you.
So when we discuss the system collapse theory and the idea of all of this falling apart, we have to look at how big and intricate the system was and how it functioned and why it was so vulnerable. Many recent articles have often compared this period to sort of globalism. But really, that's a modern comparison by modern people. But this trade network spanned these many countries with goods flowing all the way from the Horn of Africa to probably via trade networks from Babylon to India and further into the Mycenaean sphere of influence. What these trade networks were represented, however, is not simply a connection between people. It's not simply a route a merchant travels, but it really does represent the ability for one society to offload goods it has access to in excess to another society which has fewer of them, and they can generate wealth from that, and in exchange they receive that society's excess goods which it needs. Ends up in societies having access to a greater plethora of goods. Without trade, it's not that simply you would have a different set, but often you'd have things you couldn't utilize. So you'd have a deficiency in some sort of good or whatnot. And with these exchanges, you essentially have the ability to generate additional wealth. You have the ability to increasingly spread that wealth throughout society, but in this case also concentrate more and more of it in the hands of powerful individuals, the building merchants, and most likely more than anyone else, the temples and the king. As these struggles happen, see people raid the coasts, earthquakes occur, famine, drought happen, the trade networks are stressed, you have a sudden and dramatic decrease in material culture and in wealth and goods. So even if you have access to these rare items, it occurs less frequently and the price would go up. As time goes on, they would disappear. And with the disappearance of those items, the ability to have that constant level of sustained wealth dissipates. And as that wealth shrinks, you essentially have class struggle. You have the conflict between whether it's going to be the powerful who have access to those great deals of wealth, whether or not they will give up some deal of those luxuries and some deal of their power, or whether it will be the common people who suffer and starve in the streets. And the wake of it, whether the internal rebellions were successful, whether it was not internal rebellions, it might have been the outside forces, many of these power structures do have to dramatically decrease in size and scale. Ultimately, when the powerful do give up their power, it is a process by which power is divested from the central authority. We talked about in the Greek area that the village chieftains and leaders essentially had to readopt an agrarian lifestyle themselves. In times like this, and when powers like, say, Assyria and the Hittites become much smaller again, essentially these empires and these bureaucracies have to shrink as the access to goods and wealth dries up. And on the surface, this would seem as though it's a sort of cultural backslide. The state is becoming smaller, and it can not sustain what it once did. But this does, as we see in this period, give an opportunity for a new way. After all, had not the palace culture of the Mycenaeans collapsed into itself during this time, would Greek democracy, as it were, have been possible to occur without that? Would it have been possible for a sort of common power of the people, as it were, to be established once more? I think it's somewhat doubtful. Throughout time, we do see this trend happen numerous times. A country will be invaded, or a country's government will undergo crisis, things will happen which will lead to one regional ruler or maybe multiple regional rulers to lose power to some degree by whichever means to necessitate a power struggle, whether it be between the ruler and the people or the ruler and challengers. These sorts of revolutions and struggles and internal civil wars, they occur throughout time across the globe pretty frequently. There are periods of time, much like the Bronze Age collapse, when entire regions and sections of the world have underwent sort of revolutionary period all at the same time. For example, in the late 18th century, you have a wave of them, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, most prominent among others. In the 1810 through 1824 period, you have the Spanish-American Wars of Independence. That would be many of the major wars of independence, which led to the formation of states throughout Latin America. And also in the 1930s, when we saw a fairly similar situation where trade and wealth dried up. You had that big interconnected network, which took a major shock, which I believe originated in Austrian banks, rebounded in the U.S. and spread worldwide into a economic situation which, when mixed with the fallout of the reparation payments in the wake of World War I, left the entire world more or less struggling with a lack of wealth, a lack of trade, a lack of confidence in government. And out of that, you did have several movements in the U.S. and the election of Roosevelt in a pretty dramatic time, which changes had to occur. But across the world, you also had the rise of fascism and far left-wing ideologies. So with all this in mind, I think the question is, is this bad? Is trade bad? Is international interconnectivity bad? Is centralization bad? For the last 10,000-ish years, humanity has moved pretty dramatically towards centralization. Communities of the late Stone Age seemingly did trade with one another. We talked about the obsidian movement in the areas likely in Armenia down to Mesopotamia. There seems to be some sort of interconnectivity between areas like Göbekli Tepe and other regions. There are ancient trade routes which seemingly spread throughout the region for some time. And as the trade continued and as technology increased, agriculture became easier, the civilizations of the river valleys grew up, and you have these civilizations in India and in Africa and in Turkey grow up. Without this move towards centralization, it's unlikely you could have had the urbanization. Without the movement toward technological progress, without the movement toward building a larger society, it essentially leads toward either some level of isolationism or Amishness. At what point is it good to withdraw from society? At what point is it good to stop embracing technological process? I think it's hard to make the case that it's ever especially good. There can be times in which certain strategies can be more effective, but largely the progress of history bends in a certain way. Those who adapt to that situation are societies that thrive.
I guess the moral of the story is you can't say centralization is bad, but you also can't say it's good. The same with decentralization. It's not inherently good or bad. Historically speaking, these trends, either toward more centralized states and economies or away from them, are almost always reactions to specific events and circumstances. Probably the most famous example of centralization failing is the end of the Roman Empire in the West, and the replacement with what often is called the Dark Age. For the people living in the early Middle Ages, decentralization made a lot of sense. Central authority had collapsed, again due to a lot of complex factors economically, politically, and otherwise, in order to defend themselves from raiders and bandits and rogue armies and the Germanic groups later the Vikings and the Huns and others, banded together into small groups of subsistence farmers and giving over authority, essentially warlords and a knightly class of warriors who promised to hold them off made sense. And indeed, in that context, it worked reasonably well. It's just that when the crisis is over, suddenly you're left with hundreds, perhaps thousands of fortified war bands and petty warlords, nominally giving allegiance to other warlords, constantly struggling and fighting with each other, leading to a long period of essentially massive low-scale warfare. And while I would argue the Middle Ages weren't really a period of stagnation, it's really hard to argue they were a period of growth as well. As I said, the moral of the story is, again, do not condemn, do not embrace these ideas. Centralization, decentralization, globalization, all of it is trying to address problems and questions and concerns of societies, is trying to react to historical events, and whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing really depends upon that particular instance and the context in which it took place.
When we look at the modern day, there is still a struggle between sort of centralization and decentralization. The most prominent one of this recording is likely Brexit, the idea of should Britain leave the European Union. The United Kingdom itself is a cosmopolitan society, so the interesting thing is, while England has its own disagreements with the European Union, while there are limitations it talks about and regulation as alike and economic restraints, in reality the UK is on small scale somewhat the same thing. It's 4 different British countries, Wales, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, wrapped together with some remnants of old colonial possessions. The UK itself is host to many immigrants and children of immigrants, some of whom have become citizens. It in itself is a cosmopolitan society, as most of the world has become in this era. To take the argument of it's best to not have to be bound by laws made in a different place other than your own country, should that mean that the Welsh, the Scots, the North Irish should desire the dissolving of the United Kingdom, as the Scots have actually suggested might be a possibility if Brexit were to go through? It's a sort of messy proposition, because if you take that same example in the United States, and someone were to say, well, an agreement like NAFTA is bad, maybe even being part of NATO is not what we should do because we should be less dependent on the needs of other countries. Could the same argument be made that, well, why should we keep the United States so large? After all, it's a massive nation. It's one of the largest in the world that spans from one coast to another on 2 oceans, and it has these various peoples and many different cultures and backgrounds. And should we dissolve into 50 different states? If the idea of each state is its own country is good, should we then dissolve those states into individual counties? What about individual townships? I think many people say the line we currently have where countries aren't the best, but in a real way that's sort of arbitrary. So why is it that people do distrust these large organizations? Why is centralization a sort of dirty word? Why is the idea of globalism and internationalism such a bad concept to some people? There is a reason why there are legitimate criticisms for all these organizations. There are legitimate criticisms for basically the track record of nearly every nation, every international group, and that's largely because real life is full of bad actors. To look at really, the term realpolitik, which is about basically applying sort of cynicism and power, like the pursuit of power and whatnot, to your politics rather than abiding by sort of a cordial or formal or informal set of rules. Really what realpolitik boils down to is
the ends justify the means.
Yeah, it's the ideals and values and agreements mean far less than results in power. And that doesn't just mean for presidents, for kings, for nation states, it's for everybody. It's for corporations, for your middle manager boss you hate. It's for all the people in society, whether they are pursuing their own interests, whether they are doing this because that's what's best for them, or simply because they are reacting because they know those sorts of people are out there. It boils down to, even if a person, a population, a nation, a leader, whatever, has an honest outlook, has a benevolent sort of set of goals for the world, for themselves, it means they have to deal with the existence of bad actors. They have to guard themselves against this. You have class struggle. You have these identity politics where people weaponize the idea of stuff like an ethno-state or try to otherify portions of their own society. It's ultimately these ways in which society is directed, is harnessed, is split apart, is whatever for cynical means. People use the ideas and the concepts in which other people hold dear for their own political motivations. These bad actors you find all levels of society. At the top of society, back in the day, would have been the decadent kings and the warlords and the emperors. These days, it's the billionaire oligarchs, and the old day, the sea peoples and bandits have been replaced by organized crime, like petty con artists, the Nigerian prince scams. It's a part of society that exists at all times, and in times of plenty and times of stability, it's typically the kings and the merchants and the wealthy class which have the greater influence in society and the more ability to extract wealth. In times of disaster and turmoil, it's often those at the lower end, the bandits, the criminals, who have more sway. As an example, when you look at the trade network as an example of how bad actors can influence one another, look at the recent example of the U.S.-Venezuela crisis. The U.S.'s whole idea of intervening in Venezuela was there's dissatisfaction, there's people starving in the street, there's medicine not getting in. It all boiled down to the Venezuelan economy had more or less collapsed. as a result of the U.S. oil embargo. So it was a case of the most powerful economic, political, and military actor embargoing a nation, collapsing their economy, and then saying, "Oh look, their economy's collapsed. How bad is that? We should really intervene to help those people." And even inside societies like that, like the U.S., which has the most power, there is still conflict inside of it. Think about the market forces which compete with those who have a monopoly on the goods and those who are seeking the goods. In the majority of the world, insulin is free or extremely cheap. I believe the second highest price of insulin in the world is like $80 in Germany, and I believe the average U.S. price is $200. So in the wealthiest, most powerful country in the world, the people there have to pay the highest prices for medicine, largely. It's a struggle. Not only is it countries buying, it's all those elements within countries, and you have the international elements, corporations. It's a big mess. It's what globalization, it's what interconnectivity is, but there are also benefits. The last thing I'd like to say on the idea of this big interconnectivity and the idea of system collapse is many articles which came out in popular journals in the wake of some of the more recent uncovered causes of the Bronze Age collapse sort of point the finger and say, "Oh, look, isn't this similar to what we're leading up to?" There's climate change, there's instability, there's globalization, there's trade networks, and then one thing leads to another, one domino falls, and all of a sudden everything falls. I think the difference is we are talking about the Bronze Age, and we're talking about the Near East, and a relatively small collection of powers. The scale of nation states, when you look at the Hittite and the Egyptians and the Assyrians, is quite small when you look at the vastness of the world today and how many nations exist and the interconnectivity of that. After all, earthquakes, famines, that sort of thing can be devastating, but rarely are modern nations completely shut down by those. For example, you had the tsunami, which led to an earthquake, which led to a nuclear disaster in Fukushima. 3 things in a row, tragic, disastrous. Japan was able to survive. Japan has some problems. Will likely spend some time picking up the pieces, making amends, and trying to clean up what happened. But Japan exists. It's still one of the most powerful nations in the world. Even nations not as wealthy as Japan, like those that often get battered by typhoons and like in Southeast Asia. The nations of the world do often send some amount of relief there, but they recover. These nations don't fall into extended periods of anarchy from one natural disaster. Now, could a much larger natural disaster occur and actually do something like that on a regional and then ultimately global scale? I think it's possible. We would have to experience an appropriately larger event. Think a massive volcanic eruption like the Cauldron volcano underneath Yellowstone Park, which, if it were to blow, could do massive damage to all of North America. Think of the solar event which set telegraph lines on fire throughout the United States. If something like that were to happen and just fry the infrastructure, if a meteor were to hit her, if multiple meteors or one big one broke up, something like that could very well lead to a spiraling, out of control, spreading disaster like this. And if something like that were to occur, you would probably look at massive increase in instability, global markets would likely crash, price instability would happen, migration crisis would escalate to an actual crisis compared to the crisis they drum up these days, and you likely see an escalation of violence, our own modern version of Sea People, sort of Somali pirates writ large. You'd likely see rise of military strongmen and the like. It could happen, but my point is that I think a lot of the people pointing toward, oh look, we already have the warning signs of it, I think those are a bit alarmist. I think for something as dramatic like this to occur, you would necessarily have to have an extremely dramatic trigger or set of triggers.
So one thing that a clever listener might have noticed is that we talked about how our understanding of events, especially major events like this, which aren't very well known, the explanations for them, the theories behind why they happen, seem to change pretty drastically. We went through several major theories in this episode. And a question that I often wonder myself as a student, and then later as a teacher had to address for a lot of their students was, well, why? I mean, we know what happened in history, right? Why do these ideas change? Why do theories change? Why do we have different explanations now than we had 20 or 30 or 100 years ago? The reality is that despite the way some of my high school teachers explained it, history is not a set-in-stone science. In fact, one of my professors, when I worked at college, the history is really more of an art form than anything else. It's based on the examination of evidence, whether that evidence is textual or physical, which I mean artifacts, sites, that kind of stuff. And when you factor in things like oral history passed down from certain groups, material culture, technological culture, all of which are studied by historians, you don't have a clear picture. You have, in the words of a professor I was very fond of back in the day, 8 puzzles mixed together with half the pieces gone. That's what you really have. And as historians, we have a number of techniques and systems that we use to analyze these, and we can often come up with some very good explanations for things, but we don't have the whole picture, and you never know what's going to be found. An archaeological expedition could unearth a new city tomorrow, which drastically changed their understanding of either that part of the world or a larger part of the world. A potentially lost historical document might be found in a private collection that no one's ever seen before, or, as happened in the early 20th century, some shepherd might stumble into a cave and find more lost scrolls of the Bible. You never really know what's going to happen. And so part of the reason why theories change is that new evidence is being found, and it's actually almost shocking how often new evidence is being found, even for relatively modern history. And new sources, new evidence, new witnesses, they can all appear at unexpected times, and you have to take them into account. You also take into account the fact that depending upon what you're studying, history as an organized discipline isn't necessarily that old. Now, to clarify what I mean by that, people have been writing history as long as they've been writing. The temple inscriptions and the old mythologies, even the Mesopotamians, were a form of history. But you don't see history as an organized academic discipline with a focus on uncovering the truth of events. Generously, it emerges in the 1700s with guys like von Moltke who talked about the rules of the historian and how they should approach evidence. But even then, you really don't see any major organizations of this on a large scale until the 1800s at the earliest. And some areas, again, Mesopotamian history is a great example of this, there weren't any major archaeological finds until the 1930s in some cases. And a lot of these areas are still unexcavated. Basically, with stuff like this, we really have to focus on what we have, and we have to be conscious of what we don't have. And so the hypotheses that historians form are based on the best interpretation they can produce of the evidence they have. And the evidence itself can also be problematic because it's written for a reason. If you go back to guys like Hammurabi and Sargon, the historical documents their eras produce are very clearly made for political reasons. They're trying to trump themselves up, they're trying to mythologize the creation of their nations, they're trying to basically create a history which is flattering to them and serve the political and social goals that they were pursuing. Not to say that history isn't valuable to us, but that means we have to be very careful in how we use it. One of the reasons the theory of the Bronze Age collapse changed so drastically. Historians first thought, sea people. Sea people showed up, they tore everything down, collapsed civilization, end of story, book closed. But that's really just based off, again, the inscriptions we find in Egypt, and a handful of other letters and a few archaeological sites we find destruction. Whether that destroyed city was a result of the sea people or someone else, or an internal revolt or a natural disaster, that's harder to tell without very careful analysis. And archaeology was even less of an organized science than history for a long time. So that gets problematic too. And of course, those Egyptian sources of the sea people I just mentioned, they were at least partly dealing with real events, but they're also partly trying to exalt Egypt as the mightiest nation on earth, and pharaohs like Ramses II and Ramses III as these mighty conquering kings. The truth is embellished and altered to better serve those purposes. What it really boils down to in the end is the historian, and by the way, we don't coordinate in some worldwide historian guild. We're a bunch of individuals, maybe small groups at times, who are pursuing these interests on our own, oftentimes because we're crazy people who like this stuff. The pay's not great, I promise you that, although I do encourage all of you to do more because it's fascinating and important stuff. But the point I'm making is, lone individual historians who study these things, they look at the evidence they've got, and they form the best hypothesis they can, taking into account all that's known, all that they've looked at, and trying to filter out what biases they can. And until new evidence and new theories arises, the old theories stand. Now, different theories might challenge each other and debates can break out. That's an excellent way to actually further understanding for different ideas and different theories to debate and discuss and compare evidence, and sometimes out of that, new collaborations emerge. But there's a lot we don't understand about the world, there's a lot we understand about the history of the world, and in eras like this, the Bronze Age collapse, partly called the Dark Age because so little evidence of it survives, just not much is known. And so, as time goes on and as more is found, hopefully a clearer understanding will emerge, but as historians we also must accept that it's possible that a clearer understanding will never emerge. In that case, we're left doing the best we can with what we've got.
The question may also emerge of why do theories become more sophisticated, more complete in modern days? As time progresses, why is it that more can be discovered as time passes? Well, part of it is simply that there are more historians, more archaeologists, more researchers now than there ever were in the past. The more people you have working on it allows for more sites to be excavated, more digs to be done, more museums to be cataloged, all that sort of thing, more classes to be taught even. And part of what comes along with that larger pool than ever before is you also have more people who have access to this. At one time, history would have been relegated to a relatively small amount of people who would be working on it and reading it. There would have been a time when most women, most people of color, most people of the working class wouldn't really have had access to a university education. Most of them wouldn't have had access to the higher levels of the scholarship and these debates where people can essentially challenge each other's ideas and try to come up with a more holistic, more rounded picture of what reality was really like. With these increased numbers of people and increased diversity of opinions and outlooks, you gain a more full understanding in addition to more sophisticated ways of doing things. There was a time when the archaeological historical community took Troy as a myth. So it was some amateur from Germany who went and dynamited his way through portions of ancient layers of Troy. That doesn't fly anymore.
Heinrich Schliemann, you maniac.
Ultimately, the Bronze Age collapse, the invasions of the Sea Peoples, the ends of these old empires, that largely serves as the bridge, the breaking point between the truly ancient world, the world of the Bronze Age, and the later era of the Iron Age. The era that most of us are actually more familiar with when we think of the ancient world, the world of Athens, of Sparta, of Rome and Carthage, the world of Alexander and the Persian Empire. This era, which is now drawing to a close, represents to them what would have been the ancient world, when they would be emerging from their Dark Age, their equivalent of the Middle Ages. This would have been their sort of height of civilization, their Rome, their antiquity, their classical age. Different mythologies look back at this period. The Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer and the early oral tradition of Greece are obvious examples. They talk the Trojan War, which is connected somewhat to this period and this violence. The Exodus and the flood myth of the Jewish Old Testament somewhat talk about this era. The Exodus, certainly, for example, in the period directly after, discuss the wandering and the strife and tribulation, followed by then the conquest of Canaan. So in a way, the Exodus directly comments on this period. They don't really talk about the Sea People. In fact, they may be claiming the credit for the Sea People and some of these internal revolts for themselves, saying we conquered these lands, when possibly they arrived after the fact. But that's how it's remembered in these periods. And you have later writers like Virgil in Rome who wrote the Aeneid, which was propaganda piece, but in its own way is not any more really inaccurate when looking back to this period than the other ones are. These various works are essentially composed to explain the bygone, forgotten days, but largely none of them agree.
There's a textbook that was used when I was in school. I think it's still very good. It's called Ancient Greece, written by 4 different people with a little complicated quote, but essentially they pointed out just how significant this transitional age actually was. That when the Greeks, who for a time were an illiterate civilization in the wake of the collapse, when they began to redevelop into the classical antiquity we think of, the age of Plato and Aristotle, and ending with Alexander the Great, and they looked back upon the Bronze Age. To them it was a myth, it was a legendary time. Books like the Iliad and the Odyssey are something about this period, age in which gods and monsters and heroes walked the earth, because they looked upon these ruined palaces and these walls made of stone that weighed tons apiece, and these grand artifacts that they couldn't make any longer. They couldn't imagine that human hands alone had made it. The transition, the cutoff, the shift of civilization was simply that significant, that dramatic.
In fact, if you look at these recountings of this period, the Iliad and the Odyssey are largely about the Trojan War. They're largely about violence occurring between Greeks and either other Greeks or perhaps the people of Anatolia. The Aeneid, someone talks about that too, but for them, that's the sort of most dramatic and violent event of that period. It's not the sea people, it's not the earthquakes and the aftermath of it, it's the Trojan War. And the Exodus, like I said, focuses more on what the people of Israel are doing, not the people of the sea. In a real way, the book doesn't really talk about the collapse. It doesn't really talk about the sea people and the violence, despite the fact the Israelites were probably fairly present at the time. If you ask me, the way it looks is it's almost as though the flood was the collapse. That this time that came before the flood of angels coming down to earth and impregnating human women and them giving birth to giants and that sort of thing, it's almost as that weird mythological period that was the Bronze Age, though. The world they describe afterward resembles the world that people would have been familiar with when it was written, the 500s BC. And in reality, the Egyptian monuments inscriptions exist, and they're not hidden, but they're not that prominent compared to all of the other inscriptions, massive statues, mortuary temples scattered throughout the many dynasties of Egypt. So it's an interesting thing to realize that while this event changed society dramatically, while it brought into many kingdoms and civilizations and forced others to change completely in the face of them, it's somewhat forgotten by the people in the aftermath. They don't really have an explanation. They don't have a coherent vision of why it happened and why all of this fell apart.
It's actually kind of remarkable in its unusualness, because generally speaking, well, this is one of the biggest collapses of civilization to occur in history. Other similar examples had happened later, and even in other parts of the world. It's very odd for a society coming out of this not have some explanation for why it happened. The breakdown of China into the Warring States period, they had an explanation for that. The collapse of Rome, they had bunches of explanations for that. And yet, history is silent on this period. People seem to have forgotten, or at least chosen to forget, exactly what had come before them and why these ancient glittering civilizations that seemed almost mythological to them were no more.
So in the wake of all of it, we see a dramatic reshuffle of the deck. The old powers are either no more or they are reduced to rump states. The new players of this conflict will be relatively minor ones or almost new ones. The Phoenicians, later they will lead to Carthage. The Israelites will play a more prominent role. The Greek city-states will completely change their sort of composition. The Persians and Iran will become one of the most major players for several centuries. It is a period in which things are about to undergo a dramatic change. Cultures change, languages shift, new religions get adopted, new styles of government are experimented with. The period that follows is one dramatically different than what came before it. In reality, there are only a few more independent Mesopotamian dynasties at this point. Our series, with the event of the Bronze Age collapse, is actually nearing its end. The power that Mesopotamia once commanded will not be so great in the shadow of this traumatic event. This has been the 4th episode of The History Hour. Thanks for watching, and be sure to tune back for additional episodes. You can find us on The History Hour on YouTube, and you can watch at The History Hour on Twitter for updates. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe. Give us some suggestions. Tell us what you think of the music. Point out all of our mistakes. And be sure to share it. Now we come to the portion at the end of our episode where we throw in some more random facts that didn't really fit anywhere else. So the first thing I'd like to note is the Egyptians in this period are known to be employing the Sheridan as mercenaries, and seemingly they employ several groups of foreigners who attempt to come and conquer their regions as mercenaries. It worked out fairly well for the Egyptians, but there is actually a pretty long tradition of mercenaries not being the most effective way to do it. In fact, there are some speculations that mercenary revolts may have been some portion of the fighting here, the violence that occurred. It might have been that some of these foreign mercenaries hired by Egyptians as well as perhaps others revolted either because they didn't get their pay or because they believed there was an opportunity, whatever the case. What is his name? Niccolo Machiavelli?
Nicola.
Nicola Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince, has a few interesting quotes about mercenaries.
To quote from The Prince, "I say, therefore, that the arms with which a prince defends his nation are either his own, or they are mercenaries, auxiliaries, or mixed. Mercenaries and auxiliaries are useless and dangerous, and if one holds his state based on these arms, he will stand neither firm nor safe, for they are disunited, ambitious, and without discipline, unfaithful, valiant before friends, cowardly before enemies. They have neither the fear of God nor fidelity to men, and destruction is deferred only so long as the attack is. For in peace one is robbed by them, and in war by the enemy. The fact is, they have no other attraction or reason for keeping the field than a trifle of stipend, which is not sufficient to make them willing to die for you. They are ready enough to be our soldiers while you do not make war, but if war comes, they take themselves off or run from the foe, which I should have little trouble to prove, for the ruin of Italy has been caused by nothing else than by resting all her hopes for many years on mercenaries. And although they formerly made some display and appeared valiant among themselves, yet when the foreigners came, they showed what they were."
Interestingly, the problems of mercenaries have not actually gone away in the modern era. There are still plenty of mercenaries being employed for various conflict. I know I'd heard reports some years ago actually, when the conflict in Yemen was still going on and still being backed by U.S. and Saudi interests, that there were mercenaries essentially being hired by the Saudis to fight in some Yemeni zones. They were essentially selling the weaponry as soon as it was issued to them because they knew it would just be replaced, because they knew the Saudis would just give them more armaments to fight. And mercenaries have a tendency to have a vested interest in continuing the war, not actually winning it. Because if the war continues, your paycheck keeps coming. If it's over, you're done.
And probably the most famous example of that is in Renaissance Italy, when it was occasionally known for condottieri, or mercenary armies, to occasionally just sort of pretend to fight so that it looked like they were doing their jobs, but we don't want to get hurt. We just want to get here and get our pay and be done with it. Though if we can sack a city and loot it and burn it, we'll do that too.
Also, the various Sea People tribes who did attack Egypt, there is one, the Ewesh, who among others is often pointed to as likely coming from the Greek islands. They are noted to be of the countries of the sea, is often attributed to them. There is some doubt, however, that they were actually Greeks, because the Egyptian records do note that the Ewesh were circumcised, among others. And you're probably thinking, why would the Egyptians specifically note which enemies were circumcised? Well, it's because, in order to tally the dead after the battle, the Egyptians figured the best way to do so was to cut off all the penises of the dead soldiers, except those who were circumcised, whose hands they cut off. I don't know why, but I will note that this is not the only place you see this happening. The temple inscription is not the only time we have genital trophies being the way people recorded their victories in these narratives. To quote the Old Testament from the New International Version, from 1 Samuel chapter 18, 20 through 27, "Now Saul's daughter was in love with David, and when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. 'I will give her to him,' he thought, 'so that she may be a snare to him, and so the hand of the Philistines may be against him.' So Saul said to David, 'Now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law.' Then Saul ordered his lieutenants, 'Speak to David privately, and say, Look, the king is pleased with you, and his attendants all like you. Now become his son-in-law.' They repeated these words to David. But David said, 'Do you think it is a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I am only a poor man and little known.' When Saul's servants told him what David had said, Saul replied, 'Say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins, to take revenge on his enemies.' Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hand of the Philistines. When the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. So before the allotted time had elapsed, David and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. He brought their foreskins and presented the full number of the king, so he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him his daughter in marriage." So in addition to this being kinda odd, with some other details such as being a man little known despite killing Goliath in the previous chapter, it's just an interesting thing that, one, the king is like, "I need proof of your victories. Bring the foreskins back." And David's response wasn't, Why that? It was just, yeah, sounds legit, is the first thing of note. But the second thing is, either he was so enthusiastic, he doubled the amount of foreskins just to prove how into it he was, or maybe they were so enthusiastic on the battlefield they could only recover half of the foreskins? Because it just says he killed 200, not that he brought that many back. In this era, we mentioned drought and famine being a driving factor in all of this. Probably the primary motivation behind a migrant crisis, should that have actually been the main motivation behind the Sea People attacks. A lot of these can be connected to climate change. Climate change has been the driver for a lot of these. It was the thing that brought the people to the river valleys at the end of the Stone Age. It was the thing that drove centralization and agricultural revolution down the Canaanite Empire and the Ur III dynasty. And this period, it perhaps was at one of its high points. And throughout the intermediate period, the Amorites and the Kassites dealt with the increasing stresses on their environment and the salinization of the soil. The truth is, climate change is bad. Like, pretty bad. I know, hot take. But the thing is, it's not bad for the Earth. It's bad for weak mammals like humans. The whole idea behind global warming, climate change, etc., it's never been really about let's save the Earth. It's more about let's not die or let's not have our civilization have dramatic problems. And here's the thing, even if you're an individual who believes that climate change is not caused by humans, well, the Hittites and the Egyptians and the Kassites didn't cause this global drought. They didn't cause a 300-year dry spell, and it ended their civilization. In fact, if you think that the Earth is going through these changes on its own through whatever means, it should be more alarming, because that means we can't simply halt or slow our activities, but we have a out-of-control climate situation that, if unaddressed, could result in dramatic changes and struggles for the current human society.